Welcome back, all you beautiful souls, to another episode of Aligned and Alive. I'm your host, Christy May, and today's guest is someone who grabbed my attention instantly. His messaging and perspectives really aligned and hit home on so many levels. For all my high achievers out there, this is the episode for you. If you are looking to master your nervous system, to gain control over your brain, body, and emotions, to actualize your dreams. I'm so excited for this conversation, which I'm certain will be a power-packed episode for everyone listening or watching. It's an absolute pleasure to bring on emotional resilience training expert and coach, Joshua Wenner.
Thank you so much, Christy May. I'm so grateful to be here.
Thank you for doing this last minute. As I mentioned, I really appreciate you hopping on. I'd like to dive in quickly with your story, which is remarkable. I took some time to obviously, just glance back at your past and what you've been through, and every part of the next paragraph, I'm like, oh my gosh. It kept going. So I wanted to give a snapshot to everyone of what you have experienced. And then of course you can elaborate thereafter, but your story really is one of overcoming very dark times, witnessing over a dozen friends or in your early years of schooling that passed from cancer, suicide, murder, addiction. In 2004, you were deployed to Iraq. Thank you for your service. And again, remaining resilient in the midst of physical and emotional challenges. And in 2007, your startup business tanked. Your business partner went off with your girlfriend. You claimed bankruptcy, and then you ended up in jail. And yet in 2009, you bounced back, earning a spot on stage as one of Tony Robbins' best speakers. And you would spend, from what I can gather, about 5 years working as an elite trainer and speaker for Tony, running over 1,000 peak performance trainings and keynotes. Now, you do one-on-one coaching, men's group podcast. You've overcome your own addiction. So you have definitely been through it, which is what I love, because I believe that's how people can really receive on such a deeper level, because they can actually, you can feel them, you can empathize with what everyone's going through. So thank you for being here. And I would love for you to kind of just take us along that journey as well. Maybe I missed some good stuff.
Yeah, the only other pieces, because there's a lot of loss that tend to be with my journey. It just was filled with a lot of loss. The only other pieces that I'll add, because I know there'll be men and you're getting prepared for a men's community, is I was the traditional man. I would say I grew up in sports, athletics, boxing, military, the traditional guy that puts things in boxes. So when I was going through the earlier losses, I actually handled them really well. I was the guy that could show up, calm everybody down, and just kind of handle things. I also grew up hunting, fishing, so even seeing blood or things weren't as big of a deal for me. And I just would put it in a box and handle things, which is most of peak performance. Most of peak performance is like, how do you change your state to actually get the result and not let your emotions throw you off task, right? So it's kind of one frame of mind or frame of thinking. And there was an experience in 2007 where my brother came to see me for Christmas and said, hey man, I've gotten into drugs. I'm shooting needles. If I don't come live with you, I'm going to die. And I told him no. And then he went back and died 2 days later. And so that was the real kind of linchpin. It was the company that I'd started to go build when he came to see me, and I told him no because I was growing the company. And that's really what launched my journey into the whole other side. So I had the peak performance side, and that really forced me into grief and loss. And I used the tools I thought I had to be resilient, and I put it in a nice little box and ran the service and went to go build the company. But then when company fell apart, all those other pieces landed. It kind of thrust me deeper into this world. And I actually started a film. I just finished my film, which is a 10-year journey documenting grief and loss and interviewing. I actually documented my journey over the last decade, and I interviewed grief and trauma experts. And I was initially doing it to go help other people, which a lot of us do. We tend to avoid our stuff by being a savior, which I'm sure we'll get into this in a little bit. So that was me. I was like, hey, let me help everybody else fix their problems. And I was trying to help other people in grief and loss because I'd been around it. And that's when during the interviews, I was like, oh, wait, I'm the one that has some grief and loss that I haven't dealt with. And in actually going in and learn to make peace with myself, that's what led me into starting to get into men's work and helping men heal their hearts and offload grief and trauma, which then led into training fire, police, military organizations. And then that naturally led into couples. Because I did men's work for a decade before I even started with women. And then the men were like, hey, can you now bring this other side of the conversation? Because usually I believe women are actually much more intuitive, much more emotionally aware, kind of leading that conversation. But when a man starts to do it, it kind of flips the script on its head. And it's like, well, now
Mm.
I'm leaning in emotionally. Now I'm leaning in vulnerably, and she's not knowing quite how to handle this because she's not used to it. And so can you start to coach her? And that's what led me into being involved with women and then eventually couples. So it's kind of been a journey filled with a lot of loss. And thankfully I'm in a really good grounded space now and kind of out of my grief coma years, as I call it. But it's given me a lot of perspective to help people to one, go into wherever they're at, their darkest, messiest point, and to help, kind of go with them there, help them make sense of the mess and what they do to
Hmm.
get out of it or lean into it, right? Because there's kind of different tools in the toolbox. Peak performance, as I mentioned, is like, hey, not getting involved in the emotions so that you can get your job done. Grief and trauma work is actually learning to go into the emotions and befriend the emotions and befriend the pain and wounds parts of us that can be really uncomfortable. So they're just different tools that give us different results.
Oh my gosh, I love it all. And that's I when you were speaking on that, the first thing that comes to my mind is I'm around a lot of high achievers, is that a lot of them, men and women, not just men, actually sit in that peak performance mode. And so they do keep suppressing and pushing things away until all of a sudden all this chaos inside of them is starting to come out. What's going on? What just happened? Because to some degree, they feel they have everything in order because they're checking the box of everything they need to get done in order to operate at such a high level, to where they're now missing the key element, in my opinion, which is the inner work, that inner stuff that we really need to dive deep in and figure out. Because if that's not going to figure out, then I feel like everything's going to implode at some point in your life. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah, completely. The metaphor I use is a lot of high achievers get financially free. That's a very tangible result.
Mm,
How do I get financial freedom? And they get financially free, but what most of them do is there's another goal, there's another goal. It's because it doesn't give them the feeling they actually thought it would give them. And
mm,
so in reality, they're emotionally enslaved. And so that's really what we help them is how do they get emotionally free? And what I often find is I just look at the world through patterns. So this may be helpful for anybody listening to it may be a little bit jarring at times, or it may bring you some awareness of what's happening. But I find most of our drivers on the high achievement side can often be tied to an inadequacy wound. And so oftentimes I find there's two primary wounds. If you just keep like going deeper, 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 it always lands on one of these two, which is either abandonment or inadequacy. And it's our deep wounds in childhood. And then oftentimes who we became to avoid that wound is what drives our success. So as an example, let's say as a child, I was a little kid, I was wanting to get my needs met from my mom or my dad. I perceived as a child that I wasn't getting. I wasn't enough. I wasn't loved. And at some level, I made up a belief it was because I was inadequate. And so I needed to be more adequate in order to get that love. And so I became an achiever so that I can actually see I'm achieving. This is how I get reinforced for love. And then I find oftentimes that project out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. We're now achieving behind that architecture of if I'm only successful enough, if I'm only achieve enough, then I'll be worthy, let's call it, right? Underneath that wound, or then I'll be loved. And then oftentimes what works in business to get successful, very different strategy to actually create a home life, to create a relationship, because it's going to require us opening our hearts. It's going to require us going in and being with some of those uncomfortable emotions if we want to be able to have an open, connected dialogue, or we're run by the wound. If we can't make
mm,
peace with it, it actually drives us. And so that's what a lot of high achievers, when they actually start to do the work, as you're mentioning, the inner work, and kind of peel back the layers, they realize they've just been running in a high stress survival state. And it's kind of like this. I look at it like the past wound is kind of like the pressure. So the pressure is kind of pushing up, and they have usually no awareness of the nervous system, which the nervous system is what's driving us to essentially, if we're under threat, it puts us into fight, flight, freeze, and appease to get away from the threat, which is the back of the brain, which is reactionary. And most of us learn to function really high levels of this nervous system or dysregulated state, and we normalize that as normal. And so oftentimes we're moving very quick through the world. We like high stress, we like high pressure, we like moving quick under those situations because it's actually dysregulated.
Mm.
And so what it takes to unravel that is we need to start learning how to actually become regulated. And when we do, we move to the front of the brain, which is compassion, empathy, rational thinking. And what it does is it gets us present to this moment. And oftentimes what I find, this moment's really uncomfortable because I have all this past debris, let's call it, that I haven't dealt with. And this feels so uncomfortable that I'd much rather go achieve again or be busy behind my work or 50 million projects or whatever, or they're just go, 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 go. I got this, I got this. Because if I stop, I don't know how to deal with all this stuff that's here. And so I'll just keep staying busy. But if I don't deal with this, I'm never going to be connected to myself. I'm never going to be emotionally free. And how can I have a relationship with my spouse, with my kiddos? If I can't have a relationship with me, I can't have it with them. And so that's usually the discrepancy. It's just we don't know. We're walking around without good models. We come from survival. And so I think we're just in a new period where we're able to actually have now tools to actually get more emotionally free that we haven't been able to before because we've been in survival states. If you track our lineage, they didn't have time. It was like, we're going to die,
Right.
so we all come from that type of survival. And so I'd say that's kind of one of the predicaments that I find most high achievers in.
And the picture you just painted of all of that had flashes of people I know personally right now that are experiencing just that. They're throwing themselves into work and bearing themselves into the next, even addiction, because there are healthy addictions and there are not so healthy addictions. And so I would love to go down a little deeper with that. So, how do you bring somebody out of that hamster wheel that they're just so used to being on so they can hop off and start getting more connected to self? How does that process usually look and unfold when you start working with somebody?
Yeah, great question. Usually they need some pain. I find it's very
Mm-hmm.
rare. I do have a couple clients now that are like, I want to be the best possible version of myself. So they're a high achiever. They're just moving the bar. And luckily a couple of them are like semi-retired. So they have some new space to do that. But oftentimes I find it takes pain first, like some leverage, like they're about to lose their marriage or they just lost their marriage or some sort of an event that throws them off that they can't quite solve. And so I just want to start there because the other part is I see some that double down because they have a negative association with therapy, coaching, or work, and it's looked at through the masculine lens. It used to be looked at as very weak. And so I don't need help. I don't need help here. I can solve it. So if they choose that route, I see people just start to literally sabotage everything, blow things up. They kind of double down as things fall apart and they can't see it. And so they start to attract bad environments, bad people, and they just kind of shadow out. So the other side, hopefully they get to either through the desire to get there or a big life challenge that forces them to face that is they're like, okay, I have some leverage to do this work. And so often the hardest part in the beginning is getting them to actually see what this is costing them.
Mm-hmm.
Because initially they don't realize it. They're like, what? My life's good. I make a good bunch of money. I have a good life. Maybe they're really funny. Maybe they're fit. Maybe they have a family or whatever, but they're not realizing how often are you emotionally dysregulated. When you get into conflict with your spouse, do you shadow into addiction? So you shadow into alcohol, substance, work addictions. Like when they start to actually look at it and see, oh, I'm in conflict this much of the time. Like I had a couple the other day, the very high achievers that were like, oh, we're actually in this conflict 40% of the time. Right. So when you stop to kind of look at it, you're like, how free am I if I'm spending this much of my time in emotional distress, ruminating thoughts? I'm not present at work. So I'm just building that in because oftentimes that's one of the hardest parts to start the journey is actually facing it and realizing, hey, this is a real problem. I need to address this. My life's good, but it can be so much better if you get this out of the way. It's almost like you've been eating McDonald's your whole life and you've never tasted a real nice like gourmet meal. So you don't even quite know what it tastes like. You're just so used to eating that. But and we'll get to painting that picture because I think if you taste it, it's a whole different reality. So the current narratives of, I use an example, they're running on like an old operating system that's built out of survival. So how they see the world is very much like fast paced, go, go, go. There's not really time to be present, to be intentional, to actually feel what's going on, to notice what's going on with their body, how they're responding to situations, how they actually want to engage with situations. And then when something happens, because they're moving so fast, they get emotionally triggered. Again, they move to the back of the brain. They're in pure reaction. So that fight, flight, freeze, appease may look like they may be a heavy fighter. They may lean into fight, create conflict, say things they don't want to say, which we have these, what I call trauma signs that pop up. It's like the gas gauge just popped up on your car. If they don't know how to read the gauges on their car and the gas gauge is on and they just keep driving, they're going to run out of gas. And so that's often what's happening is they start their day with very low tank. They're driving, something throws them off kilter. They don't know how to read the gauges, and then things are blowing up. And then unfortunately, what happens is we typically move into a shame spiral because we don't like the way we behave and we beat ourselves up. And that's what can start to lead to addictions and some of these other pieces, because the greater the pain or the greater the pressure, the greater the pleasure. So we're seeking something to get away from that pain or that pleasure to take us out of that because it's so intense. Yet we've created that type of life for ourselves where we have to operate in that high pressure. So a couple other ways this could look, maybe it's not a fighter. Maybe they lean in fight, or maybe they just take off. Maybe they bail. They take off on their family. They take off on a work environment when things get heavy and they just take off. They could also move into more of a freeze appease response. This looks a little differently, but what I find happens is what happens when they get emotionally dysregulated, they can't feel themselves. They almost go numb. But what they do is they get really good at feeling their environment. So they can feel, and oftentimes this is a spouse dynamic where you have one spouse is more fight or flight. The other spouse is freeze appease. One spouse leans in over the top up here when they're dysregulated. The other spouse goes numb and then just tries to either appease them, walk away and dismiss them, or yell in and meet them in that fight. And now what's happened is one person's highly dysregulated. When they walk in the house, if one person's dysregulated, you're going to automatically throw off the other person. So now we're both dysregulated. And now we got in a stupid fight around the dishes and it turns into a blowout match that can get really severe. And we can say really hurtful things because both of us are in reactive parts of our brain. We're both in survival states and it's automatic. It's reactionary. There's no thought. So that's kind of the picture I want to paint is if you're moving through the world that fast, you're just going to keep bouncing into things, whether it be business associates, spouses, kiddos, where you blow up or you run away or you shut down and then you're beating yourself up. So that's kind of where I see the operating system as, let's say, current state. What's running beneath that is you got all this pressure from stuff you haven't dealt with from your past that keeps pushing you in to keep driving faster to avoid feeling what's actually there. So I'd say that's like current state where oftentimes we start. And again, that bang event goes, okay, I don't want this. I'm willing to do the work to face this because I want a better life, or I want to save my marriage, or I want to feel free. I'm sick of feeling enslaved to my life. And so, or to my emotions. The path off of that, what we have to do is I really break it down into three foundations. So the first foundation is learning emotional regulation. So in order to do this, you have to learn how the nervous system works, and you have to learn how to start identifying when you're in the back of your brain, which is dysregulated, and move to the front of the brain, which I described earlier. Because again, compassion, empathy, rational thinking, what happens is you're now aware in the situation. And if you're back here, you're in reactionary. So as an example, if I'm going through the day and I get triggered and I start to move into a conflict, I can actually catch the conflict in the middle of the conflict, or as it starts, or before it starts. I can call an audible or call pause. I can get myself regulated there's just tools that you learn to get regulated, move into here. And now I'm able to see what's actually happening. And I'm able to choose how I want to respond. So I could show up very lovingly. I'll give one example of this. There is one core, because I'm going to talk this through in patterns as this comes up, because the same patterns I find play out again and again. There is a client of mine who, that dynamic, his wife was a freeze appeaser. When she would get dysregulated, she would obsessively clean and call everybody else but him. Right? Well, he was more the fighter flighter. So he'd be busy out at work. She was actually at home. They both run businesses, but at this stage, they were at home when we started working together. And he would walk in the door almost expecting her to be like, honey, I'm home. And she'd be like cleaning, calling her mom, calling everybody but him. And what he used to do when he was dysregulated, running fast, is he'd walk in and start a conflict. What's going on? Why aren't you giving me attention? Like it would turn into this big conflict. What would she do? She'd freeze because she's already dysregulated. Whatever you want, I'm sorry. And then he would get more mad because he's like, you're not telling me the truth. So they would create these big conflicts, but they didn't know they were in dysregulation. That sometimes could go 2-3 days. Once he learned to implement emotional regulation, just this one piece, he walked in the door, was able to identify and go, oh, I'm about ready to start a fight. I can feel this. She's doing that thing again. let me take a break and get myself resourced. So then he would say, okay, I'm going to take a walk out. So I'm going to take a pause, which I'll give you one of the metaphors. One of the tools I teach is called CPR. And we use CPR to resuscitate somebody when they're unconscious or close to death. And I use that same example. When we're dysregulated, we're unconscious. We're not aware. So if the C is, can you consciously become aware that either you or somebody you love or somebody in your environment is dysregulated? Then you move to the P, which is literally pause. Because if you are or they are, you're all about to be dysregulated. And then R is you need to move into regulation before you can engage. Because if you don't have rational thinking, if you don't have compassion for yourself or your spouse, and you don't have empathy, you're not going to solve it. You're literally not, there's no way to solve it. So he was able to realize it, go, okay, conscious awareness, she's dysregulated or I'm dysregulated. I need to take a quick pause. He built a strategy where he'd walk outside, he'd walk the dog, which is one of the ways you get regulated, physical contact. He did a very specific breath work where you're starting to do longer exhales than inhales for 6 minutes. He would splash some cold water in his face. He'd remember that he's coming home to take some of the armor off from his busy day at work and reintegrate back home. And then when he walked back in a different part of his brain, he has a lot more options because he's thinking rational. He has compassion for himself. Like, I'm doing much better. He has empathy for his wife. And then he's like, looks like she had a tough day. This has nothing to do with me. And he walked up to her and said, hey, honey, it looks like you had a tough day. You need a hug? I'd love to give you a hug. Would you like to talk about your day? So just those two different examples, what did that change in the household? And they didn't both need to change. He changed. He was able to lead that conversation very differently because he was emotionally resourced, right? And what do you think that did to the relationship? The conflict stopped with that one dynamic, which was a constant pattern that would show up again and again in their dynamic, right? So it just shows when you really start to master emotional resilience or really emotional regulation or your nervous system, I call it you're moving from a survival brain to more of a thriving brain. So you're upgrading your brain to this type of brain. The way the brain evolves is it starts off back here with the reptilian brain, which is like the back of our brain. This is like autonomic nervous system. This is fight, flight, freeze, appease. This is what makes your heart beat. This is what makes everything run. Then it moves into the limbic brain, which is like emotions and gets you highly reactive. That's where they call the smoke detector is that identifies if there's something to throw you back here. That's why you get emotionally triggered. You're immediately back here. And then the top of the brain, which is thoughts, words, and actions. And then this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that we keep talking about, is not developed till 26. So the challenge is like from 26, we've already developed so much of our identity and who we are that it takes work to actually build this part of the brain that we can now use on a regular basis. So first part's emotional regulation.
All that is so incredibly powerful. So the first thing that comes to mind is while you're explaining this so perfectly is oftentimes you don't have both couples that are all in on that growth path, right? So what if someone is more self-aware and has all the tools that they're utilizing that you just stated, but the other partner isn't there yet and they just don't know how to get there? So you're still kind of in a combative state to some degree because one of them is maybe a little bit more accelerated than the other along their journey. So they can pull back and go, okay, let's take a pause. We need this right now. But the other one wants to keep coming at them. So how do you navigate that playing field when it's not on the same level or understanding that you both are committed to this process?
It's a really tough challenge. I'll speak of this a couple different ways. Ultimately, you both have to be in the relationship, right? Like I see sometimes where somebody's like trying to go after a relationship and the other person's not even in it. They're like, I don't even want a relationship. That's a very different context than two people who are in it, right? So I'll speak to the one that is not in it. Oftentimes we have, if it's a woman, there's a father wound. And at some level, she's trying to overcome the father wound. If only I can love him enough, if only I can give him enough love, he'll come back. Or it could be flipped if it's a man with the woman, more the mother wound. So if one person's out and the other person's trying to make it work, very different dynamic than if both people are like, hey, we're in this, we're just struggling to make it work. And so I'll speak to that one for a moment.
Right.
I actually just had a couple the other day where the woman reached out and was like, hey, we just had a big blow up fight. Like we need to get some help. This isn't working. We unpacked the call. She got him to show up, even though he wasn't going to be there. And I could tell he was pissed. Like he showed up on the call. He's like, I was grateful he showed up. He's mad. And he's like, and I checked in with him. He was like, I don't want to talk. You said I didn't have to talk. I just have to be here. I'm like, all right. And so she talked the call and we went through it all. And then at the very end, because I was speaking to a lot of what I was seeing, even though he wasn't, I knew kind of some of the patterning. he softened up and he started to speak up. And one example was, one of the complaints she had is she's like, hey, I'm very focused on working. I'm wanting to get this done. He's not wanting to work. He's not wanting to do it. And when she said it, from my perspective, he's on the call, even though he's pissed. That shows me he wants to do the work.
Yeah.
And what I identified just in their process, she has what I'd call more of the, because I study archetypes, and that's one of the maps I use. She's got more of that warrior and what I'd call queen archetype. So she moves fast through the world. She wants to take immediate action. She's very quick moving, which again is a lot of high achievers, black and white. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Oftentimes you're going to attract the opposite, which for me would be like that magician, sorcerer, lover dynamic, which that's what her partner clearly was, which means he's very like systemized, process, procedure. He also could be more in his heart and take a little bit of space. So what was happening was she's coming in quick, wanting to grow, wanting to move. He needs a little bit more time to digest what's going on, feel what he feels, and come back to the table. So they had a different pace. And she was expecting him to be at her pace and couldn't see where he was showing up and wasn't acknowledging him for the growth he was doing, and was holding instead that he wasn't growing, he wasn't doing it. And to go another layer deep, just because this is really big for the masculine, our deepest desire, and every man, I've been with thousands of men and done a lot of deep retreats at the wounding, no matter how it looked on the surface. When you take off all the layers, like our deepest desire is to serve. Like that's where it originates. So we want to serve our partner more than anything. Like we're literally like I'd say we're really sensitive, even though we don't show it, and we have layers to show that it's not safe to show it. But at the core, we're deeply sensitive. We care deeply. A lot of our motivation is to serve. We're actually very thoughtful and take a lot of time to try to serve. But one, we're very different species. And so how that's communicated oftentimes from just not knowing how to communicate to each other, it's often met with whatever you do is not enough, right? And so if we're trying to serve and we're showing up all these ways and it continues to feel like it's not good enough, inadequacy wound starting to get triggered, then that inadequacy wound is going to put me in the back of the brain where I'm gonna freeze and appease. I'm gonna fight and flight. I'm gonna pull away. And I think this starts to kind of show the landscape of what's happening. Like in that same dynamic, let's say it's a spouse that really loves each other. They're wanting to grow. Let's say she comes in dysregulated, wanting to fight about growth. Now they're already dysregulated. And then this is how the pattern shows up. In this example, her wound was abandonment. His wound was inadequacy. And I find this happens a lot. And so even though they both had abandonment in their childhood, one's stronger than the other. So she would show up and start telling him all the things he's not doing right, or he's not good enough. You're not growing with me. You're not showing up, triggering right in his abandonment wound. And what would he do? He'd then go abandon and go out with his friends, or he'd go to other things, which then triggers her wound. And so we end up ping-ponging each other's wounds, not intentionally. It's just, I believe we attract it so that we can actually heal it and learn to love it to actually bring us back into wholeness. So I'm kind of breaking down the layers of, oftentimes I find one of the spouses is not seeing how the other person is willing to grow. They just may not be patient, and they may not be acknowledging the growth. And instead they're often focusing on what's not working. And again, that can trigger that inadequacy wound. So I think, they both have to be on the same page. And oh, here's one other piece I will say. What I have seen time and time again, if one spouse starts to do the work, because I see it with men, right? And again, I believe, it's my belief that women are actually more emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent. I believe the women lead from an emotional level, and I believe the men lead in different levels. So, but when I see men do this, because that's what I've been training men to do, when they're able to show up very differently, women look at actions. They don't listen to necessarily words, but they're like, show me your actions. So when a man very differently starts to show up to a situation, instead of being emotionally triggered or fighting or breaking down, let's say he's a freeze appeaser and he can lean in and say, hey, I'm not leaving. Take it down a notch. I need you to treat me with respect. He does that to a fight or flighter. She's like, who is this man?
Yes.
Right. And she's going to start to be like, whatever he's doing is working. So if he leads first and starts doing the work, she's much more likely to come with him on that journey because she's seen results. And the flip side, let's say somebody was leaning in heavy on the fight and flight side, and now all of a sudden they're pausing, they're calming down, they're asking questions, just like the example I gave earlier. They show up very differently. What that does to the spouse is it gives them hope, or like, because usually I find they have the same story. There's built up resentment, and it kind of ping pongs at different types. So one spouse will be gung ho and the other spouse is like not into it. And then they get frustrated and they take a break, and then the other spouse is gung ho. And so we're kind of at different teetering. And so if one spouse leans in, you're like, I just did this and you didn't want to come with me. So there's kind of this little bit of resentment. But if one spouse is just like, I'm going here and I'm going to keep loving you and I'm going to keep showing up differently, and this is where we're going, and they start to see results, what it does, you start to get your needs met. You start to feel seen, you start to feel validated, you start to feel loved on, which is what we deeply want. And when you start to see that met, you're like, hey, now are you willing to come with me on this journey? You're much more likely to go like, yeah, where are we going? How do we practice these tools together? Or they naturally start to practice together. Like, what are you doing? And they'll start asking questions and like, hey, I've been doing regulation. You want to regulate together. And then you can build it. When I'm coaching, we're starting with the person doing the foundational work for the first kind of stages. And then the second stages is learning how to build it into your family unit, where now you have a system that's actually supporting you and you guys are aligned and you're doing it together. Because that's when it's a superpower. When couples do it together, I've seen them on the edge of divorce, and within 2 months, they've turned the whole thing around because they just learn how to emotionally regulate. They learn how to show up differently. They're taking ownership for the things they're projecting on each other. And then they're learning how to have really authentic, loving conversations, and start to communicate needs and boundaries. So I started with emotional regulation. Those are the other two pieces. So I find the three foundational pieces is emotional regulation. Secondly, we have to learn to deal with when we're triggered. What's happening is something from our past is getting triggered from our relationship, somebody else, and we often blame them, which is really hard if they do something, right? This is a hard one. So I want to discern this for a second. Oftentimes what's happening is something from our past triggers us with the person that we're with. And then if we don't take ownership and figure out what's coming up for us and start to feel through some of those pieces, we're not going to be able to feel our needs and boundaries. We get caught in what's called the villain, victim, savior dynamic, where they're the villain, we're the victim, and then they need to come save us again, which is all forms of codependency. And so if we can start to say, hey, I'm triggered, if both partners are practicing this, hey, I'm triggered, let me take ownership from this. Oftentimes, if we're triggered, either a boundary was crossed or a need's not being met. At first, can I meet this for myself? So for women, can I get safety in myself? For men, can I start to nurture myself without needing that from my partner to do for me? And when I can start to do that, now I can figure out what I need and what my boundaries are, and I can start to have really loving conversations. Because if I can start to be with my own inadequacy, if I can start to be with my own abandonment, the reason we don't have authentic conversations is because we're too afraid of being abandoned and being rejected or not, which is another form of not enough. So we have these surface level conversations out of fear of our wounding. So when we can start to be like, oh, I'm triggered, it's always going to be my wound. Can I go start to be with that wound and get safety for myself? Can I be with that lack of nurture and start to do self-care practices? I see this with a lot of men, is we're craving nurture and women are craving safety usually. So can I do that in myself? And when I can, now I'm able to say, oh, okay, I can calm myself down. And now I can start to request, here's my needs, here's my boundaries, which is really treating each other how to love each other. And then if we can meet those, that's kind of the triple dynamic. If we can do those three pieces, that's really the like foundational level to start to have a really rich relationship. So I know I went a little off track from your question, but I hope that kind of rounded around.
Oh my gosh, it's giving me chills because I'm thinking of all the relationships out there that could be saved if people would just show up and actually commit to doing the work. This does go a little bit into my second part question with it, though. At what point do you or have you experienced where couples do start showing up and, working through this process, and then they come to the fact that we love each other dearly, but maybe we're not the best for each other? Do you see that actually happening to where they can actually come together in this beautiful love and experience of evolution? And then they do come to that calm realization that I finally see you, you see me, but maybe this just isn't meant for that next chapter of our lives. Does that happen?
It does. Yeah. I had a couple that I coached that worked back from an affair, because I've done a lot of messy things. And oftentimes I'll say this, oftentimes what I find is really helpful is we don't start rebuilding the intimacy. We start rebuilding the friendship when it's become off track. So we start like, hey, can we just because I'm very goal outcome focused. Let's rebuild the friendship, because no matter what happens, we need to have the friendship, especially if there's children involved. So let's make that goal. And they're doing the same work we talked about in order to get there. And I usually, if they're both committed, they get there. And what's beautiful about getting there is now that we're there, there's more intimacy, there's more connection. We can start to see like, oh, we're actually feeling more connected. We're able to see more seen, and we can have really authentic conversations. Yeah. And to me, this is the piece. When we start to have really authentic conversations around needs and boundaries, what we're learning is, hey, I'll put it like this: we're moving from codependence to independence to interdependence. So the motto of codependence is like, I'm doing this for you and you're doing this for me. So we're codependent on meeting each other's needs. We're moving into independence. It's like, I got me, you got you. And then we're learning to make clear requests. But if they're not met, I can still meet my need, but I can at least practice making requests for my needs and boundaries. Boundaries is a little bit different because it's a request or requirement, right? Requirement is like, if this doesn't work, I'm going to leave. Request is this would be really nice. And then we move into interdependence is like, what would love do, right? Like, I don't need anything back. And my resource to give love, you had a clear request. I'm happy to fill that up, but I don't need anything from you. I'm just giving it because love would give it. When we start to practice that, what happens is we're having really authentic conversations and we start to actually get really real. That's at the point when I find when we're having those conversations, some spouses have different desires, or they met a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And when they're actually getting real and they're having these very authentic conversations, they're like, we actually don't align with our actual needs, boundaries, and our goals anymore, or the vision for our life. And so that's when it makes sense to separate, because they're just different humans and they're able to do it in a really loving way. So I've mediated divorces where it was like a mediation, some coaching calls, and they both paid $5,000, right? For like an attorney versus hundreds of thousands of dollars in courts. Like, they just really lovingly were able to separate everything, transition everything, and find really ways to help it. So it can be done in really loving ways if they rebuild the foundation first, but you don't really know until you get there, because most couples aren't being authentic, is what my experience is. And so until they can be really real, one with themselves, they just don't know. They're so used to like trying to meet each other's needs and don't even know what their own needs are. This is actually a really big one. So often it's so hard to meet our partner's needs because they don't even know what they need. So until we can figure that out and start to communicate that, we don't really know if it works or not, because we're both kind of have some masks on and we're both so fearful of our wounds. We're at all costs trying to avoid them. And that's why we stay in the dynamics that aren't healthy, because we're afraid of abandonment. We're just stuck in these, again, survival patterns of like, I'm not really happy, but I'm not really super fulfilled. So I'll just keep eating the McDonald's every day because I'm surviving and it's somewhat functional. And we kind of get used to settling. When there's such a rich life of like deep intimacy, deep passion, aliveness, fun, vitality, where life gets to be very different and it's very subtle. This is one other piece I want to make. There's a man that he would tend to be more that fight or flight response. He tended to be more the villain in the dynamic. And he's like, I need to change this. I'm getting married. I don't want to be this man anymore. Started doing the work, doing daily emotional regulation, started doing work on his past, started noticing where it was perfectionism that would come up, was one of his big pieces. So he started to catch when he did some somatic work, oh, when he didn't get his love met from his parents as a child, he thought it's because he made up the belief it wasn't perfect. So unconsciously, from a little 6-year-old child, and now it's a 50-year-old adult, he was still running that response in his nervous system. So unconsciously, when things weren't perfect, he would move into this villain type mindset and back of his brain survival, because he was still reacting to his childhood response to his 50-year-old lifestyle that had nothing to do with it. And then his energy would blow up the space. And then he'd feel shameful, move into a shame spiral, and go harder into work. So he's busy workaholic, yet that was kind of his yo-yo. When he was able to add the tools, one, he reshifted his whole business around, doubled his business, because he's like, I don't need to work this much. I can put team members in place, and they grew up better than he did when he was actually spending more time at home. Because I do find we tend to hide behind work because it's an easy way for achievers. Like, oh, if I'm really busy, I get away with it because nobody knows. But really, I'm just busy running from life because I'm not present. So I'll just throw that little tap, tap, tap for any achievers listening. And me too. Anything I say in here, they're the same with me. I did the exact same thing. I was a workaholic for years and was avoiding my life because I had a bunch of grief and I was just trying to work it while trying to save the world to avoid dealing with my pain. So me too. And then what he was able to do is he was able to shift it. And he even went through a period where his whole house they found mold right after he bought a brand new home. They found mold and they ripped his whole part of the house, which for him would have been like, he would have been nuts. And he was able to get regulated. He was able to be like, it's my emotional state that brings the love, not if things are perfect. And so he was able to radically shift. Notice when he was getting a little dysregulated, go get regulated and move in. And there was even one moment when he brought like lawn chairs out and he's like, let's make this a fire night and let's do s'mores. And literally he turned it into this really fun evening where everybody had a blast. And so when you get really good at it, you start to create moments. And this is what I'm saying. You get intentional. You have space and time to think about how you want to show up. You're able to understand what's contracting you, navigate that situation, and then actually decide how you want to show up. And when you do, your energy is what creates the environment, right? So when you're happy and joyful and playful on the masculine side, playful, fun, charismatic, it's a very different energy than tight, tense, controlling, demanding, right? Or on the feminine side, when you're playful, sensual, bringing your radiance, it's a very different energy than when we can also shut down on that other side. So I just want to paint the picture. That's the subtle shift. It's not this huge dramatic change. It's like all this work to catch these subtle moments and choose how you want to respond, which then you get all this massive love and you get what you actually want. So it gets really addicting once you see it.
Ooh, I'm addicted. Like it just makes me what I've been feeling lately around a lot of people is just, being so intentional with my environments and who I'm around and just sitting in the feeling of how did I feel when I left that conversation? And it's not to say it's not coming from an ego space. It really is coming from, is this the right environment for me? Is it supportive, co-creative? Is it aligned with my vision and mission and purpose in life? And leading with that lens, especially the last several weeks, I'm like, those aren't my people. And I love them. I love them, love them, love them, but they're just not my people. Everything you just painted is so powerful and is available to everybody. If we want to take the time to dive in, be intentional, do the work, commit, we can literally create a reality or wildest dreams. I mean, I really do believe that, but attitude is everything. And specifically how you choose to show up every single day. It's not just this one time I read this book or I took this mastermind or I hired this coach and everything's good to go. This is a commitment every single day to become the best version of you so you can attract that best relationship. I mean, that's kind of like where I see it. And I'm sure just from what you've just shared, it's very similar into the men and women you work with.
Yeah, 100%. And just one piece I'll add to that is, yeah, like when I coach, you're doing emotional regulation every day. It's not when I feel like it, it's not when I'm dysregulated. It's like you either do it every, because here's the difference. When I'm coaching, if you do it every day, you don't loop the same patterns.
Yes.
So the difference is when somebody's doing it, so they're doing it 1 to 2 times a day, and when they're dysregulated. And when they do it, they move really quick. They get really good results. When they don't, they start looping. So for me, if you loop, we either change the goal or we stop working together. So I just have really strong boundaries with it because you get results and I'm an outcome guy. So it's like, I don't want you to be doing this for 10 years. I want you to get a result fast and get your life back on track. So do the work or not a good fit, right? So it does take work. It is hard. It's brutally hard. It's hard facing yourself. It's uncomfortable, but there's so much joy. It's like anything else that building your business took a lot of work and energy. But then when you build it, you're like, oh, I'm so grateful for what I built, or building your body or anything else takes a lot of effort. But when you do there's so many rewards to come from it. I agree with you in the same thing. I think when we start to become more aware, we start to notice the subtleties of how we feel, which is what I'm hearing you say is like, does this feel good? And then we start to identify like, oh, am I triggered? Or is this just not an environment that's lighting me up? And we start to change our environments, our people, like everything that we're doing starts to change so we can feel good. So I'm on the same page with you there.
Yeah. And life becomes so much more enjoyable. I mean, it really does. We don't have to sit in suffering. People choose to sit in suffering. I really do believe that. And I know because I've been there before, or I've sat in this hermit mode of just, this loop of suffering. And like you mentioned, like becoming so emotionally regulated is the cursor to interrupting the pattern, to changing your whole life's experience is just becoming emotionally regulated. And I love that you share that. There's so many. I mean, I'm looking at the time right now and I'm like, my gosh, I have like a gazillion questions I want to ask you because there's so much. All this is so good. I would love to ask you before we do depart, specifically speaking on the men's group that I had mentioned. And I know one of their questions was, from a woman's perspective, what are you seeing in regards to how women are viewing masculinity these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's the way I look at it, we had the Me Too movement. And there was a lot of men taking advantage of women, hurting women, and in ways that weren't okay. And that was kind of a push back with like, we're not taking this anymore. Fuck this, which is very needed and very valid. And so there's been that wave of movement. And I also believe with that wave of movement, there's been a lot of ownership from a lot of men saying, hey, you're right. This is not okay. We take ownership. And then there's kind of the same wave of movement coming up with masculinity right now, where now it's coming up with men because of that anger and frustration. Some of it's stuck there, right? So some of it, like you have the red pill men movement, you also have the same with women. So there's this varying degrees of where it's at, but I do find there's a lot of women that are just angry with men in general. From my lens, oftentimes I believe men are the problem and we're also the solution. So for me, I believe we've created a lot of problems and we're also the solution. So men stepping up, taking ownership, and honoring where we need to go is the approach. And I've even found when I've done a post, I did a post that I created a context of like how women need to share negative emotions with men. And it was from a client that got really good results. But I used a very specific context, which was from a past pain and something that kept coming up, that worked really well. And I realized a lot of women were getting really upset. And I was kind of like, I moved into defending because I was feeling attacked. And I saw a lot of the comments, a lot of really angry women, like men are just boy. And so I got to see the consciousness of the anger and the hurt and the upset that a lot of women have, which is very valid. They have pain. And for me, what shifted is once I was like, oh, you know what? You're right. I had the wrong context here. There's definitely some contexts where it's justified. There's once I practiced the same work. Oh, this was a certain context of miscommunication. We're miscommunicating. Let me validate what they're feeling. And I have another lane that's also true. All the energy shifted and I stopped getting all the conflict. So I think there's definitely a movement of anger. And for the men that are asking, there's a great delineation because somebody's mad and emotionally upset. Because you validate their emotions for their feelings, it doesn't also mean you're taking full ownership for things that you may not believe are true. Because also I find is like somebody had a different experience through their trauma lens or through their past experience of what happened. And then what did I hear the other day? It's like somebody does the thing. Let's say the guy does the thing. And then the woman's reaction to the thing is so big because it's also pressurized with past wound that now it moves away from what the thing was to focusing on the woman's reaction to it. And I think that's one of the dynamics that the women are reacting to. Like you did the thing, right? So I think there's a mutual ownership that needs to take place. And it goes back to what I was saying around emotionally regulated, taking ownership and moving out of villain, victim, savior, but it's co-ownership, meaning whatever we create, there's some ownership there. So if I have a spouse that's angry and upset at me, like I was creating very intentional content, a lot of women are upset. At first I got defensive, like what, men? And I'm defending. And then I went, wait, I'm being defensive. Let me take some ownership here. What's going on with me? And I was able to feel what was going on and take some ownership and say, hey, you're right. Yeah, in this context, your context doesn't. And so I had to take ownership to meet them there. And so I think the same thing happens with women. Is like there's got to be a co-ownership so we don't get caught in victim, and a victim story. And I think that's where we're kind of heading. So I think for the men listening, if somebody is really upset, what part about that can you own and take and kind of meet them in their emotional state, meet them where they're at, but also remaining in integrity with being respected, right? It's like one thing to say, hey, I understand you're upset. I understand you have a lot of emotions. Totally valid to be angry and upset, frustrated, and not okay to disrespect me. Now, granted, like some of the context, the man may have disrespected the woman. So again, this is where it gets like the subtleties of what's happening. So my invitation would be really check yourself and see where you have potentially been out of integrity in the first place or in the past. So you can own that because ownership starts to take us out of those places. And oftentimes I feel if we haven't really owned it, then the other partner doesn't feel safe. And that's when things loop again and again and again, is when we don't really own something. So if you can really take ownership, one, and then two, I also want to say there's a lot of women that are so positive men, so positive reinforcement, right? That are really deeply doing the work as well. So there is a lot, but I think we have to heal together. So I think like, how do I be nurturing? If somebody's upset, how do I be nurture their heart for a minute? Like, oh, like, how do I see they're sad? Oh, you've been really hurt. And I'm really validating. There's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of suffering there. And I'm really sorry you've been hurt by men. I can totally validate that and not have it mean that I'm a bad guy if I've been able to be with my wounds. If I'm not okay with my abandonment wound, just full circle this, Then she says it, I'm going to get defensive and then get triggered because my abandonment wound's triggered when it had nothing to do with me. Right. So
Yep.
I think this is the co-ownership work of like, how do we do the work and really be nurturing and compassionate with each other? And how do we
I
heal together?
I couldn't agree more with you. And I know what post you're referencing because I actually commented on that
Oh,
post. And shortly after, I saw a slew of comments coming in. I'm like, whew, wow, people, calm down.
yeah.
Like it got real vicious. And
Mhm.
I was thinking that. I wonder how you were able to navigate that whole process because it can feel very attacking. And I know what you meant in your post. And I thought it was well said, but I could see where but like you said, it's coming from our own trauma lens, right? And you
Mhm.
could see the ones that were highly wounded by the way they
Mhm.
were just attacking and responses rather than going, great perspective. I can understand that. However, A, B, and C. So it's really interesting to actually you learn a lot by observing, right? I mean,
Well,
there's
well, yeah. And if you can bring that to them to say, hey, instead of going into defense, which is hard to do, right? They may
yeah,
fail, but if you could just validate their experience, it diffuses it immediately.
absolutely.
Right. So
Absolutely.
it kind of takes it away from the defending. If you notice you're in defending, that's when you're already off track.
Yes. I love that. I could go on for hours with you. You have so much great info.
Mm.
I do like to leave all of my episodes with something fun. It's just a way for
Right.
everyone to get to know you on a more intimate level. It's fun. It's 10 fire questions.
Great.
And I named this one Getting Juicy with Josh.
Right.
So, all right. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. And then we're going to go into what you have to offer everybody. So stay tuned because we're going to talk more about that. All right. 10 questions. The first thing that comes to your mind. What was your very first job?
Very first job is I was a busboy at a
Okay.
restaurant.
What books have shaped your career the most?
Um, Think and Grow Rich, um, and probably The Body Keeps Score. And I'll say those two for now.
They're good. Who has made the most influence in your life?
My brother,
What is the hardest challenge you've had to overcome?
my brother, my brother's death.
What is the most embarrassing moment of your life so far?
Most embarrassing moment. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is when I was like, I think in elementary school, and I was standing on the diving board and like somebody pants me on the diving board when our whole class was outside. I think that was a pretty embarrassing moment.
That'd go down as one for sure. What is your proudest accomplishment?
What comes up right now is just completing my film, which has been a decade and a lot of time and energy and money and effort. So finishing this 10-year film called The Gift of Grief, which is my actual 10-year journey.
I can't wait to see that. What's one idea that you think the majority of people get wrong?
Awareness of the nervous system.
What is one of the best or most worthwhile investments you've ever made? It could be investment of time, money, or energy.
I would say, yeah, energy into actually doing somatic work, doing like really deep somatic work is what brought me back online and brought me back to life when I was offline.
What can people expect from you next?
A lot more, continuing to bring more of my full self to the world. So
I love that. And what is one final thought you want to leave our listeners?
that back to that same concept that the masculine wants nothing more than to serve at the deepest level. And if you could start to see men through that lens, how may you communicate differently with them?
Mm, so
And if you can appreciate them for that, like they'll do whatever you want.
so good. I love that. And with that being said, can you elaborate on your offering that you do have for is it a men's group coming up or what does that look
No,
like?
actually I had so many people reaching out of saying like, hey, you're showing this content and I'm pretty high end to when it comes to one-on-one coaching. So I created a group program that teaches the fundamentals that I teach in coaching, but in a group dynamic. So it's called the D Spot. It's Divine Love, Harmony in Your Sex and Love Life. It's for individuals and couples. And it's essentially a 4-week curriculum where we cover emotional regulations. A lot of what we talked about in here, emotional regulation, which is the first module for romance and intimacy, more based
Mm,
around partnership. somatic tools. So what types of somatic tools can you start to take some ownership and be with the emotions that are coming up for yourself? The third one is getting into needs and boundaries. Like, how do you actually start to identify your needs and boundaries and really learn to communicate those in loving ways? And if we can build that foundation, we get into the good stuff, which is all about polarity, dominance for great sex. Like, okay, now when you're having things good, how do you create more intimacy? How do you lean into polarity, which is we're going to require some dominance and stepping into these different areas so that you can really have fun and actually have deeper intimacy. So,
Yes. Light
and that
that
launches
fire.
April 4th.
Oh,
Yeah,
April
it'll be
4th.
fun.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm going to have all links in the show notes for everybody. You guys
Right.
know I always hook you up. Don't make it hard for you. So you can go click on that. And of course, I'll have Josh's Instagram handle. You can connect with him there, and your website. All the good stuff's going to be in the show notes for you to readily get connected with. Do you go by Josh or Joshua? What do you prefer?
Joshua.
Oh, Joshua. Okay. I like to be honorable with that because my given name is Christine, but I can't stand being called Christine. So Chrissy is what
Do you go by Chrissy or Chrissy May?
just Chrissy. People think that though. So they think my
Oh.
name is Chrissy May. It's actually my last name. But yeah, my dad was from the South. He was from Tennessee. So hence the May. Yeah, it's a very Southern last name. But thank you from my entire heart. I am so gracious that you've been able to hop on and deliver so much. I mean, it's a wealth of information. It's power packed because this stuff works. It really, really does. And I feel like there's no better gift than the gift to give someone. I think about, just in closing, what you mentioned about couples coming together. And if you're in a season of life to maybe where you don't necessarily feel that you'll be together forever, I like to look at it as an opportunity to heal and really transmute all of that right now in real time. So when you do enter into that next relationship, you're not repeating the pattern. You're actually interrupting the pattern, and you're doing something for the collective consciousness, for us to evolve and grow and flourish, so we don't keep spewing the same old story over and over. It's an opportunity to heal at such a entirely bigger level than I think that people really take note of. So that's where people like Joshua are here to help. Yeah.
I deeply appreciate it. And so fun. Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun. Really appreciated your questions, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So thank you, Chrissy.
Thank you. Make it a beautiful day.
Thank you.